So now let's catch our notes up with what we just talked about. On that T-chart underneath the box, on one side you'll need to put position. On the other side, you'll put condition. So we said that objects can get potential energy from either their position, where they're positioned, something about that, or the condition, how the object's made. And so we just saw from our example that one way you can give an object potential energy from its position is because of its height. If you put it up higher than it was before, the energy that you used to do that is now stored in the object. It now has the potential to fall. And what causes it to fall? Gravity. It's caused by gravity. We learned a couple of principles about this, that the more height you give the object, the more potential energy is stored. You have more potential energy stored in you when you're on the high dive than you do on the low dive, because it takes more work to get up there. And also, the more mass the object has, that also gives it more potential energy. It takes more work to get, an NFL player to the top of the high dive than, say, a kindergarten kid. And so, therefore, more energy is stored as they come down. And then we also saw that there's some examples of this. So let's look at this first. Have you ever seen one of these kinds of roller coasters? Yes, these look like little kid roller coasters, and now that you're big 5th graders, it may not seem like such an exciting ride, but trust me, they're still actually pretty fun. But notice how roller coasters work. They actually use potential energy to help themselves go. If you've been on one, you know that as you go up a roller coaster, there's usually a first high hill, and there's a mechanism that pulls the carts up the track. You'll hear it going chick, chick, chick. You ever heard that before? And as it gets you to the top of the hill, you don't hear that anymore, because once it gets the carts to the top of the track, all the energy that was used to get them up there is now stored. And that energy is enough to take it throughout the rest of the roller coaster ride. Usually, on most roller coasters, there's a really tall first hill, and then the energy that gets stored in the carts from that first hill is enough to take it to the top of the next hill, which is usually a little bit lower, until it goes throughout the ride. But compare how much energy these carts have with how much these would have. Look how much higher this ride is. It takes a lot more work to get cars to the top of this hill. And so, as you're going up the hill, that's usually when I'm regretting my life's choices. Why did I get on this thing? Oh, I wish I'd never done this. And when you come off this first hill on this roller coaster, you are really moving because you have so much more energy to use. Now, let's look at this question. Here we have 2 magical floating flower pots. Which of these has more potential energy? The one on the left or the one on the right? Remember our principle, the more height, the more energy. Yes, the one on the right has more potential energy. Now, here's a tricky question for you to think about. So here we have 2 kids. They're both lifting objects, moving objects to the top of this ramp. Now I know they're objects. One looks square and one looks sort of roundish. But let's assume that both objects will be at exactly the same height when they get to the top. Let's also assume that they have the exact same mass, and they're going to tip off that high edge on the left there instead of down the ramp. When they fall off, which one would have more potential energy? This is a pretty tricky question. When we did it in class, there's a lot of debate back and forth, arguing about the girl did more work or the boy did more work. And I don't know if you've ever had to help someone move, like with a U-Haul van where you have a ramp to lift the furniture up. There's a reason that they use ramps on those big vans, because it does a lot of the work for you. And so if both objects have the same mass and they're going to be at the same height, they're going to come down with the same amount of energy. It seems like the boy may be doing more work because he's lifting it straight up. But over the course of the ramp, the girl may not have to push as hard, but she's doing it over a greater distance, so it'll be the same amount of work when they're done. Now, let's make our notes catch up what we said about forcing an object beyond its normal position. One of the things we learned was that if you have an object and you force it beyond its normal position, that also puts energy in it. We had a rubber band. We use the energy in our arm to pull the rubber band beyond its normal position, and that energy is stored there, and when we release the rubber band, it goes flying. We call this elasticity. It's being stretched beyond what it normally is. Another example of this is a spring. If you take a spring and squeeze it down or compress it, the energy used to do that gets stored in the spring. When you move your hand out of the way, the spring will go flying. Another place that we see this concept is with a bow and arrow. The reason a bow and arrow works is the energy you use to pull the string back is now stored in that string. And if you have an arrow in front of the string, when you release the string, as it snaps back to its regular position, it pushes the arrow along. Let's look at these examples. So you can see here the man's hand here. Here's the normal position of the bow, but he uses the energy in his arm to pull it beyond its normal position. And then when he releases it, it's going to snap back into its regular position, taking the arrow with it. And then here's the spring. Here's the normal position of the spring. But if we compress the spring, the energy we used to do that is now stored in the spring. If we let go of it, it's going to push the block forward. Now we use this in a lot of applications in everyday life. A good example of this is one of those Jack-in-the-Box games where it's like a little clown or a toy stuffed in a box, and you turn a crank, and then at some point the box opens up and the creepy clown comes flying out of there. There's a spring inside of it, and when you mash the clown down, it compresses the spring, and then as you turn the crank, eventually it removes a lever that's holding the spring, and it lets the toy come flying out. So there's a lot of different ways that we use this. A ballpoint pen's another example of it. Now, look at these two pictures. We've got a bow and arrow, and we've got a wrecking ball. Now, both of these are potential energy from position, but one of them is from gravity being up high. The other one's elasticity being stretched. Which one is which? Yes, the bow and arrow's elasticity. We're stretching that string beyond its normal position. And then the wrecking ball uses gravity. You know, when they use a wrecking ball, it's really heavy, and they get it as high as they can so that it can have a lot of energy as it smashes into the side of whatever wall it's trying to knock down. If they didn't get it very high, it probably wouldn't do as much damage. Now, here's the next thing I want you to do. I'm going to show you this video clip of a girl jumping on a trampoline. As she jumps, there are 2 times in the video where she has the most potential energy. See if you can spot both of those times.
Think about someone on a trampoline. Can you identify when the person has the greatest amount of potential energy? There are 2 times when the potential energy is the greatest. One is at the height of the bounce. The other time is during the landing, when the trampoline material is stretched. When the person begins to bounce up, the stored or potential energy begins to change to kinetic energy, enough energy to throw the person into the air. At the top of the bounce, the kinetic energy changes to potential. Then, the person begins to fall back towards the trampoline. The potential energy changes to kinetic.
So, what were the 2 times? You probably said when she was at her highest point. It looked to me like when she was doing that last toe touch that she was really, really high. So she had a lot of potential energy because gravity's going to really be able to pull on her longer. But also, she gets potential energy stored in her also when she lands. Every time she lands, she stretches the fabric of the trampoline and those springs. And then as the springs snap back into position, and it forces her up even higher. That's why you're able to do jumps and flips on the trampoline that you couldn't do on the ground, because you're getting extra energy for every time you make an impact on the trampoline.